Disguised as a servant, a millionaire tested her fiancé's family, revealing unexpected truths about their character. Grace Taylor gazed out the airplane window, watching the vast Arizona desert stretch beneath her like an endless canvas. Despite the clear blue sky, her mind was clouded. For weeks, she had battled doubts, but now there was no turning back. At 32, she was a successful CEO, leading one of the most innovative tech companies, Tech Solutions. Yet, behind her strong, confident exterior, she carried the weight of her humble beginnings. Balancing the woman she had become with the girl she once was had always been a struggle. Her relationship with Oliver Walker, a brilliant lawyer, had brought unexpected happiness into her life, but it had also resurfaced insecurities she preferred to bury. No matter how lovingly he treated her, Grace couldn't escape the question that echoed in her mind. What did Oliver really know about her? About the hardships she had faced? The times when her family barely had enough food on the table? Even worse, what would his wealthy, traditional family think of her? This uncertainty had driven her to embark on a bold, perhaps insane plan. She wouldn't be meeting the Walkers as the powerful CEO Grace Taylor. Instead, she would disguise herself as a simple housekeeper, blending into the family's daily life to test their true values and intentions. It was a calculated risk, but one she felt was necessary to determine whether she could build a future with Oliver. Upon landing at the small local airport, Grace swapped her pristine business suit for worn, plain clothes in the restroom. She tied her hair into a messy bun and wiped away the subtle makeup that usually enhanced her natural elegance. Staring at her reflection, she barely recognized the powerful woman who led meetings and made million-dollar decisions. Now she looked like just another invisible person in the crowd. The Walker mansion was even more impressive than Grace had imagined. A grand structure surrounded by meticulously trimmed gardens, with architectural details that exuded wealth and tradition. When she rang the doorbell, it was Helen Walker, the family matriarch, who answered. Her sharp eyes scanned Grace from head to toe, as though appraising her like an object. "You must be the new hire," Helen said without waiting for confirmation, her voice as cold as the luxurious but impersonal atmosphere of the house. Grace hesitated but quickly nodded. "Yes, that's me," she replied, keeping her nerves in check. Helen didn't smile. She simply stepped aside and gestured for Grace to come in. The interior of the house was just as grand, with opulent furniture and art pieces strategically placed. Yet there was a chill in the air, as if the sophistication failed to make the space feel welcoming. "We have a few rules here," Helen began as she led Grace through the house. "We don't tolerate tardiness. Common areas must always be spotless. And please limit your interactions with family members. Your place is behind the scenes, ensuring everything runs smoothly." With every word, Grace felt a subtle hostility hidden in Helen's commands. She kept her head down, murmuring acknowledgments as she absorbed it all. This was the matriarch's true nature, and Grace was ready to face the challenge. That's when Emily appeared, a young woman with brown hair tied in a ponytail, carrying a heavy tray of dishes with effortless grace. Her smile was warm and welcoming, a stark contrast to Helen's tone. "You must be the new helper. Welcome," Emily said, placing the tray on the table. Her voice was sweet, almost disarmingly so. Grace smiled back, feeling a wave of relief. "Thank you. I think I'll need some help finding my way around." "Of course. I can show you where everything is. It's a bit confusing at first, but you'll get the hang of it quickly." Emily glanced briefly at Helen, ensuring the matriarch had left the room before whispering, "Don't worry, she's like that with everyone." Emily guided Grace through the house, showing her the areas she'd be responsible for and where to find cleaning supplies. During the tour, Grace noticed that Emily was much more than just an employee. There was something in her eyes, a spark of determination, maybe even a hint of rebellion against a life that seemed to confine her. Emily spoke of her dream of studying business management, though she admitted it was hard to find the time and money to pursue it. In the days that followed, Grace grew accustomed to the grueling routine of the Walker household. Helen found fault in everything Grace did, from the arrangement of silverware to the way she mopped the floors. Richard, the patriarch, was more reserved but no less condescending. Always with a book in hand, he observed the staff with an air of intellectual superiority that grated on Grace. On the other hand, Emily became a constant source of support. During brief moments of rest, the two would talk about their lives. Grace, of course, had to fabricate details to keep her true identity hidden, but she listened intently to Emily's stories. The young woman dreamed of being respected for her intelligence, not just her ability to clean a house. One evening, while tidying Richard's office, Grace noticed a shelf lined with books on corporate ethics and social responsibility. The irony wasn't lost on her. This man, who publicly preached values, couldn't apply the same respect within his own household. That night, Grace lay on the narrow, uncomfortable bed in her small room, feeling the weight of the day on her shoulders. Her disguise was working, but the mission was proving more challenging than she had anticipated. Every interaction with Helen or Richard was a stark reminder of how deceiving appearances could be. Yet, when she thought of Emily and the glimmer of hope she carried, Grace felt her resolve strengthen. She was ready to face whatever came her way, even knowing that the road ahead would be long. The first pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, and Grace knew that sooner or later, she would have to confront the truth she feared most. What did Oliver Walker truly represent? The next morning, the first ray of sunlight slipped through the curtains of her small room. The thin mattress didn't allow her to forget the discomfort, but to her it was part of the role she was playing. Even so, the emotional burden of her disguise far outweighed any physical exhaustion. Each day in the Walker household was a mix of revelations, challenges, and a growing awareness of how social status dictated interactions in that world. In the kitchen, the familiar sounds of clinking pots and boiling water filled the air. Emily was there, preparing the family's breakfast with mechanical dedication. Grace joined her silently. "You sleep well?" Emily asked sympathetically. Grace hesitated but responded with a faint smile. "Well enough. You seem like you're used to all of this." Emily let out a brief, bitter laugh. "You get used to it. It's not easy, but what else can we do?" Before Grace could respond, Helen entered the kitchen. Her presence always made the air feel heavier. She scanned the room, and as usual, found something to criticize. "Emily, this table isn't ready yet," she snapped. Turning to Grace for the first time that day, she added, "I want you to clean the main hall as soon as you're done here. We have guests coming this afternoon, and I don't want them to see a single speck of dust." "Understood." Grace nodded, keeping her head down. Inside, her patience was starting to wear thin. Every interaction with Helen was a harsh reminder of what people like Emily had to endure daily. Still, she knew her mission depended on her staying in character. The main hall was a masterpiece in itself, with expensive furniture, imported rugs, and chandeliers that looked like they were made of pure crystal. Grace was on her knees, scrubbing the floor, when she heard Richard's firm footsteps behind her. She sensed his presence before even hearing his voice. "The floor should shine like a mirror," he said in a tone that was meant to sound polite but carried an air of superiority. Grace mumbled something in agreement, still scrubbing, but couldn't help feeling a surge of anger. The irony of hearing this from a man who publicly preached values like equality and empathy was almost unbearable. Silently, she continued her work, determined to observe more than speak. When she finished, she found Emily in the hallway, struggling under the weight of a heavy stack of towels. Emily looked exhausted, but she still managed a smile for Grace. "Helen's in a good mood today. She's only complained to me 3 times so far," Emily said, attempting humor that didn't quite mask her frustration. "How do you deal with this every day?" Grace asked, genuinely curious. Emily shrugged, pausing to adjust the towels. "You adapt. My mom used to say some battles aren't worth fighting, especially when you know you can't win." Grace felt a lump in her throat. She wanted to tell Emily that every battle was worth fighting, but she knew it would be hypocritical. Emily didn't have the luxury of choosing her battles like Grace did. All she could do was tuck that thought away, considering how she might help Emily in the future. The afternoon brought Helen's guests, a wealthy couple clearly from the same social circle. The now spotless living room became a stage for fake laughter and shallow conversations about investments and charity dinners. Grace, serving tea and cookies, watched everything in silence. That was when Helen made a comment that nearly caused Grace to spill the teapot. "Housekeepers these days are so hard to find. They just don't have the same standards we grew up with," Helen said, turning to the guests. "You understand, don't you?" The guests laughed in agreement. "Oh, absolutely. It always feels like we have to supervise everything. Otherwise, the house would fall apart. Grace felt her blood boil. Even though she kept her head down, she could feel their eyes on her and Emily, like they were nothing more than invisible objects serving a purpose. Despite her anger, Grace kept quiet. Speaking up would risk everything. That evening, while cleaning the kitchen with Emily, the young woman finally spoke. "You heard what they said, didn't you?" Emily asked without looking at Grace. Grace nodded, waiting for Emily to continue. "They always talk like we're not here, like we don't have ears or feelings." There was a long pause before Emily murmured, "I want so badly to get out of here, but how?" Grace stopped cleaning and turned to face her, wanting to tell Emily there was a way she could help, but she knew it wasn't the right time. For now, all she could do was promise herself she would act. "Never lose hope," Grace said quietly but firmly. "Things can change." Emily didn't respond, but her eyes spoke volumes. She wanted to believe Grace's words. Later that night, as Grace prepared for bed, the weight of the day felt heavier than ever. The Walker family's masks were beginning to slip, revealing the hypocrisy beneath layers of sophistication. But what haunted Grace the most was the question she couldn't shake. Where did Oliver fit into all of this? She knew he would return soon, and when he did, her mission would become even more complicated. The days dragged on, testing Grace's patience. Life at the Walker mansion was exhausting, both physically and emotionally. Every interaction with Helen was a delicate balance of obedience and avoiding conflict. Richard, though more distant, exuded the same superiority, making the atmosphere feel like a constant competition for who could be more untouchable. Emily, however, remained a bright spot in the chaos. Grace clung to their conversations, learning about Emily's dreams and frustrations. Emily wanted to study and be more than a housekeeper. She wanted freedom. And while Grace kept her true identity hidden, she found in Emily's dreams a reflection of her own journey. Then, one warm morning, everything changed. Oliver came home. Grace was in the kitchen, washing dishes alongside Emily, when she heard the front door open. Voices echoed through the house, warm with laughter and familiarity. Oliver had a way of filling a room with energy, and even without seeing him, Grace's heart began to race. "Looks like the prince is back," Emily said with a soft laugh, drying her hands. Helen was always more tolerable when Oliver was around. Grace smiled, trying to mask the nervousness creeping over her. She knew it was only a matter of time before she'd have to face him. The question was how? A few minutes later, as Emily wiped down the counter, the kitchen door opened and Oliver stepped in, laughing at something Richard had said. He looked different from the last time Grace had seen him, more relaxed, but with the same magnetic presence that had drawn her to him in the first place. "Oh, you must be the new housekeeper," Oliver said, stopping to look at Grace. His tone was friendly but casual, like a polite obligation. Grace froze. Slowly, she turned to face him, keeping her posture humble and her gaze lowered. "Yes, sir." For a brief moment, Oliver's eyes narrowed, as though something about her seemed familiar. But he shook his head, distracted, and continued, "Well, welcome. I hope my mother hasn't been giving you too much trouble." Grace almost laughed but managed to keep a straight face. "No, sir. Everything's fine." Oliver smiled warmly before leaving, and Grace remained still, listening to his footsteps fade down the hall. He hadn't recognized her, not yet. Emily, sensing the tension, glanced at Grace. "Are you okay? You seem off." "I'm fine," Grace replied quickly, returning to her work. But inside, her mind raced. Oliver was here, and everything had just become more complicated. In the days that followed, Oliver began noticing Grace more often. He saw her in the hallways, the gardens, even the living room, always busy, always fulfilling her role as a housekeeper. There was something about her that intrigued him, but he couldn't quite place it. Helen, however, seemed more suspicious than ever. One day, while Grace served tea in the study, Helen pulled her aside. "You walk around here like you're spying on the house," she said, her eyes locked on Grace's. "I hope you understand your place." Grace kept her head down, responding simply, "Yes, ma'am." But inside, her resolve only grew. Helen didn't know it, but her behavior only strengthened Grace's purpose. That afternoon, Grace was in the garden, watering plants when Oliver approached her again. This time he seemed more focused. "Can I help with that?" he asked, taking the watering can from her hands. Before she could respond, he added, "There's no need, sir. I can manage." "Please call me Oliver," he said, smiling. "The sir stuff makes me feel old." Grace was taken aback. Oliver was closer now, and she noticed he was studying her as if trying to figure something out. Her heart beat faster, but she kept her expression neutral. "All right, Oliver," she said reluctantly. He smiled, but there was something more in his eyes. A spark of recognition. "Have we met before?" he asked, tilting his head. Grace froze for a moment, then quickly shook her head. "No, sir. I mean, Oliver." Oliver narrowed his eyes but didn't press further. He simply smiled briefly before handing the watering can back and walking away. As soon as he disappeared, Grace exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. He was suspicious. It wouldn't be long before the pieces began to fall into place. Meanwhile, Emily was also feeling the pressure. Helen, irritated over something trivial, had accused her of negligence during breakfast, despite Emily having done her job perfectly. Helen made sure to reprimand her in front of the guests. Later, in the small room they shared, Grace found Emily crying silently. She sat beside her, saying nothing at first. "It shouldn't be like this," Emily said, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "I just want a little respect." Grace placed a hand on her shoulder. "You deserve more than respect, Emily. You deserve a chance to show what you're capable of." Emily gave a sad smile but didn't respond. To her, that still felt like a distant dream. Grace knew she needed to act soon. Her mission was no longer just about testing the walkers. It was about ensuring Emily had a chance to break free from the cycle. And deep down, she knew Oliver would be the key to changing everything. But he'd have to see the truth before it was too late. The following days at the Walker mansion brought a mix of tension and revelations for Grace. Oliver's presence shifted the household dynamic. He was charismatic and kind to everyone, but his kindness seemed uninformed, more a reflection of good manners than a true understanding of what was happening around him. For Grace, maintaining her disguise was becoming more difficult. Oliver continued to watch her closely, as though trying to figure out what didn't quite add up. Helen, meanwhile, seemed determined to create an even more hostile environment. She ramped up her demands and criticisms, especially toward Emily, who was starting to show signs of wear. One afternoon, while cleaning Richard's study, Grace stumbled upon a small pile of old papers in a drawer he had left open. They were employee records, terminations, warnings, and even complaints about working conditions. One name caught her attention: Camilla Hayes, Emily's mother. The record showed that Camilla had worked at the mansion for nearly a decade before being abruptly fired for poor performance and disrespectful behavior. Grace frowned. She knew Emily well enough to believe that someone as dedicated as her mother wouldn't have been any different. Something about that explanation didn't sit right. Before she could investigate further, she heard footsteps and quickly put the papers back. Richard entered the study, barely glancing at her before sitting at his desk, immersing himself in one of his books on corporate ethics, an irony Grace still couldn't get over. But the discovery about Camilla weighed heavily on her mind, and she knew she needed to ask Emily about it. That evening, Grace found Emily in the kitchen, scrubbing one of the counters harder than necessary. It was clear something was bothering her. "Emily, is everything okay?" Grace asked, sitting at the table to avoid seeming intrusive. Emily sighed, dropping the cloth and leaning against the counter. "My mom, she worked here for years, you know," she began almost unprompted. "But she was fired suddenly. She never told me the details, but I know it was because of Helen. My mom said something she didn't like." Grace's heart sank. "And how did that affect you?" Emily let out a bitter laugh. "How do you think? My mom spent months unable to find another job. We got behind on rent and almost lost the house. That's why I started working so young, to help my family." Grace placed a hand on Emily's shoulder. "You shouldn't have to carry that burden alone. Your mother was wronged." Emily shrugged. "Maybe, but what can we do? These people have all the power. We're just invisible to them." Grace felt a surge of anger. Emily wasn't invisible to her, and she knew the Walkers would have to face reality sooner or later. The next morning during breakfast, Grace witnessed yet another example of Helen's hypocrisy. While serving tea to the guests, She overheard Helen boasting about her charitable initiatives with a false smile. "It's so important to give back, you know, to show the world that we truly care," Helen said, adjusting the diamond rings on her fingers. Grace kept her expression neutral, but she noticed the discomfort in Oliver's gaze. Grace felt the tension in the air as she continued her work, and for the first time, Oliver seemed out of place beside his mother. It was like he didn't want to be part of the conversation, and for a fleeting moment, Grace saw a flicker of dissatisfaction in him. It gave her hope. Later, while cleaning the library, Grace was taken by surprise when Oliver entered quietly. She noticed his reflection in the window before he spoke. "You know, I've never understood why my mother cares so much about appearances," he said, leaning against the desk with a hesitant smile. "To me, actions speak louder than words." Grace kept cleaning, avoiding eye contact. "Not everyone sees it that way, Oliver." He paused, then took a step closer. "You know my name?" Grace froze. She had made a mistake. Before she could correct herself, Oliver pressed on. "I'm pretty sure we've met before. I don't know where, but there's something about you." Grace placed the cloth on the desk, finally facing him. She needed to buy time. "I think you're imagining things." Oliver smirked slightly, but didn't seem convinced. "Maybe, but something tells me you're not who you say you are." Grace tried to keep her composure, but inside, she could feel the pressure building. She was running out of time. Oliver was getting closer to uncovering the truth. That night, Grace met with Emily in secret, away from the watchful eyes of security cameras and Helen. There was something she needed to share before it was too late. "Emily, listen," Grace said, her voice steady yet filled with emotion. "You have the potential to change your life, and I want to help you." Emily looked at her, confused. "Why do you care so much?" Grace hesitated. She couldn't reveal everything just yet, but she spoke from the heart. "Because I've been where you are, and I know that sometimes all it takes is someone who believes in you." Emily held her gaze for a moment before nodding slowly. "Thank you." In that moment, Grace made a decision. No matter what happened, she would do everything in her power to help Emily break free from the cycle that trapped her, even if it meant revealing her true identity. From a distance, unnoticed by Grace, Oliver watched from the balcony. His expression was a mix of curiosity and concern. He knew there was more going on, and he was determined to find out what it was. The morning began with a palpable tension at the Walker mansion. Helen was more irritable than usual, and her relentless criticism of Grace and Emily seemed charged with something deeper, as if she sensed that something was off. For Grace, maintaining her disguise was becoming increasingly difficult, especially with Oliver now asking questions that seemed dangerously close to discovery. In the kitchen, Emily tried to keep things light as she prepared lunch. "Helen is even more Helen today," she said with a forced smile while chopping vegetables. "I think she caught a whiff of our resistance." Grace smiled faintly, but inside, she was worried. Emily was starting to speak more freely, expressing frustrations she had once kept bottled up. Grace feared this could lead to trouble. Mid-conversation, Helen entered abruptly, her eyes narrowing at Emily. "These plates aren't clean enough. Do you expect me to serve my guests with this?" she snapped, holding up a plate that looked perfectly clean. Exhausted by the unfair criticism, Emily took a deep breath. "Sorry, Mrs. Walker, I'll wash them again." Helen narrowed her eyes. "I hope so. And do it quickly. I have no patience for incompetence." Once Helen left, Grace saw the tears forming in Emily's eyes, though she quickly wiped them away. "It's nothing," Emily said, returning to her work. "I'm used to it." Grace felt a wave of anger rush through her. Helen had no idea how much she was crushing this young woman's potential. But for Grace, this was just another reason to stay committed to her mission. That afternoon, Oliver found Grace in the garden, where she was trimming some plants. He stopped a short distance away, watching her before speaking. "You're good with your hands," he said, his voice carrying a hint of curiosity. Grace glanced at him briefly before returning to her work. "Thank you, sir." Oliver stepped closer, crossing his arms. "I've already asked you to call me Oliver. But you know, I've been thinking, you really do seem familiar." She stayed focused on her work, trying to remain calm. "Maybe I just have a common face." "No," he insisted, tilting his head. "It's more than that. Something about you." Before he could continue, Helen appeared on the veranda, calling out to him. Oliver, come dear, I want your opinion on something. Oliver hesitated but eventually walked away, casting one last look at Grace before leaving. She exhaled in relief, but she knew he was getting closer to the truth. Later, while setting up the dining room for a formal dinner, Grace overheard a conversation between Helen and one of her guests, who was seated on the couch laughing. The new maid is so diligent, the guest commented, glancing in Grace's direction. But she lacks refinement, don't you think? Helen chuckled lightly. Oh yes, she tries, but some people just have their limits. There's no point expecting more than they can offer. Grace's blood boiled, but she remained silent. Conversations like this only reinforced what she already knew. The Walkers, at least Helen, saw the people around them as tools, not as individuals with intrinsic value. After dinner, as Grace and Emily finished cleaning the kitchen, Emily broke the silence. I don't know how you do it. I see the way she treats you. She doesn't even try to be polite, Emily said, loading dishes into the dishwasher. Grace leaned against the counter. Because I know this is temporary. Emily looked at her, intrigued. What do you mean? Before Grace could answer, the kitchen door opened and Oliver walked in. He looked relaxed, but his eyes quickly locked onto Grace's, his expression more serious than before. I need to talk to you, he said, ignoring Emily, who glanced curiously at Grace before hurrying out of the room. Grace tried to appear indifferent. Of course. Oliver closed the door behind him and stepped closer. I have to ask, who are you really? Grace's heart stopped. She tried to maintain her composure, but she knew the moment had come. He was about to piece everything together. I'm exactly who you think I am, she replied, her voice steady. Oliver didn't back down. No, you're not. I know there's something more. I don't know what you're doing here, but I'll find out. He left before she could respond, leaving Grace alone with the weight of his suspicions hanging over her. That night, Grace barely slept. With every step she took to maintain her disguise, she felt closer to being exposed. Oliver was on the verge of discovering the truth, and Helen's hostility only seemed to be growing. But amidst the chaos, Grace thought of Emily, of her mother's story, and the cycle of abuse that needed to be broken. And as she stared at the ceiling of the small room where she slept, she made herself a promise. She wouldn't leave this house without making a difference, even if it meant risking everything. The morning began quieter than usual at the Walker mansion. There was a palpable tension in the air, as if something invisible was about to unfold. Grace, trying to keep herself busy, focused on cleaning the living room, even as her mind wrestled with Oliver's words from the night before. He knew. Maybe not everything, but enough to start asking questions. Later, while Emily was in the kitchen preparing lunch, Grace decided it was time to share what she had found in Richard's files. She needed Emily's full trust before everything fell apart. Emily, I need to tell you something, Grace began, sitting down beside the young woman. I found information about your mother in Richard's office files. Emily stopped stirring the pot and turned to face her slowly. About my mom? What did you find? Grace hesitated but delivered the truth. Her termination was labeled as disrespectful behavior, but I'm sure it was something else. Helen probably found any excuse to get rid of her. Emily pressed her lips together, processing the information. I knew it. My mom always said she didn't do anything wrong, but she never gave me the details. Grace took her hand. Your mom was wronged, and it affected your family for years. You deserve better. Emily, your mom deserved better. Emily's eyes glistened with a mix of anger and determination. But what can we do? They have all the power and we... Grace interrupted. Don't underestimate what we can do together. Before Emily could respond, Helen abruptly entered the kitchen, her gaze darting straight to them, filled with suspicion. I hope you're not wasting time gossiping, she said, her voice dripping with disdain. The garden needs watering, and the dining room is still a mess. Grace swallowed her anger and nodded, pulling Emily out of the kitchen before the young woman could say something that might get them into more trouble. That afternoon, while watering the garden, Grace once again felt Oliver's presence. He seemed to appear out of nowhere lately, like a hunter sensing his prey. Can we talk? He asked, his voice less confrontational than it had been the night before. Grace set down the watering can and turned to face him. There was no point in avoiding it any longer. All right. Speak. Oliver took a deep breath, as if searching for the right words. I know you're here for a reason. I know you're not just a housekeeper. It doesn't add up. The way you carry yourself, the way you act, there's something you're hiding. Grace studied him for a long moment before deciding he deserved the truth, or at least part of it. You're right. I'm not who you think I am. Oliver's eyes widened slightly, but he kept his composure. Then who are you? Grace took a deep breath. That's a story for another time. I'm Grace Taylor. Oliver took a step back, clearly confused. Grace, my Grace, the CEO? She nodded, maintaining a steady expression. Yes. What's going on here? Why are you doing this? His voice was filled with disbelief and confusion. Grace chose to be honest. I needed to know the truth, Oliver. About your family. About you. I wanted to see how you treat people. Without the weight of my title or my money. He ran a hand through his hair, frustration evident. So you did all this to test me? Grace shook her head. It wasn't just about you. It was about me. I needed to understand what I was stepping into before moving forward with our relationship. Oliver struggled to process it all. You should have told me. I would never have let you go through this. Grace gave him a small, sad smile. And that's exactly why I didn't tell you. You wouldn't have let me, and I would never have learned the truth. He fell silent for a long time before speaking again. And what did you discover? Grace met his eyes directly. That you're different from your parents. But also, that you've been complicit with them for far too long. Oliver seemed about to argue, but something in her tone made him pause. He knew she was right. That evening, Grace decided it was time to confront Helen and Richard. She knew it would be a turning point, but she couldn't continue the charade any longer. As Helen and Richard chatted excitedly about a charity event they were planning, Grace entered the dining room, Oliver by her side. Silence descended as Helen saw her. What are you doing here? Helen demanded, clearly irritated. Haven't we told the staff to stay out of this area during meals? Grace stepped forward, lifting her chin. I'm not staff, Helen. Richard frowned, adjusting his glasses. What are you talking about? My name is Grace Taylor. I'm the CEO of Innovatech Solutions. And Oliver's girlfriend. Helen's jaw dropped. Richard removed his glasses, clearly trying to process what was happening. This must be some kind of joke, Helen said, her voice full of disbelief. Grace remained composed. It's not a joke. I came here to see who you really are, beyond the surface. Helen started to protest, but Oliver intervened. Enough, Mom. She's telling the truth, and I think we need to listen to what she has to say. Grace seized the moment. You've treated the people around you like disposable tools, as if they don't deserve respect. That's not just unfair, it's cruel. Richard, who had been silent until now, spoke up. You think you can just come into our home and judge us? Grace met his gaze unflinchingly. I'm not judging you as people. I'm confronting your actions. If you want to change, that's up to you. The silence that followed was heavy, but Grace knew she had planted a seed. Later that evening, Emily found Grace in the garden. So you really weren't who I thought you were, Emily said with a small smile. Grace smiled back. But everything I told you was true. I want to help you. Emily's voice wavered with emotion. Thank you. I'll never forget this. As the stars sparkled above, Grace felt a shift. A moment of transformation had begun. The disguise was gone, but the impact of her presence in the Walker household was only starting to unfold. The morning after the revelation, the Walker mansion was heavy with tension. Helen seemed to walk faster than usual, her expressions shifting between confusion and anger. Richard, typically reserved, kept to his office, and Oliver avoided confronting his parents directly. Emily, however, appeared more at ease, as though the weight of the secret she'd carried had finally been lifted. Grace knew, though, that the real battle was still ahead. At breakfast, Helen finally broke the silence. So, Grace, or should I say Miss Scott, do you plan on telling us what you were really trying to prove by infiltrating our home? Her voice dripped with sarcasm, but genuine curiosity lingered beneath it. Grace calmly set her coffee cup down. It wasn't my intention to humiliate anyone, Helen, but you needed a mirror. You needed to see how you treat people outside your circle. Richard, who had entered moments earlier, raised an eyebrow. So you consider yourself that mirror? Someone entitled to judge us. Grace took a deep breath, maintaining her composure. It's not about judgment. It's about accountability. You've created an environment where people have no voice, where they're treated as tools. That's hypocrisy. Especially from a family that preaches ethics and social responsibility. Helen stood abruptly, eyes blazing with anger. You don't understand how things work in this world. We've always done our best to protect our reputation and legacy. Grace rose to her feet as well. At whose expense, Helen? At the expense of people like Emily, or her mother, Camilla, who was unfairly dismissed because she dared to question how she was treated. Emily, who had been listening from the doorway, froze. It was the first time she'd heard her name spoken in this context. Helen fell silent, visibly taken aback by the mention of Camilla. Camilla was dismissed because she didn't fit the standards of this household, Helen said defensively. No, Grace corrected her, her voice firm. Camilla was dismissed because she had the courage to challenge an unjust power structure. Richard tried to intervene. That was in the past. We can't change what happened. Grace met his gaze directly. But you can change what's happening now. You can start by recognizing the value of the people who work here. Starting with Emily. Emily hesitated before stepping into the room. I don't want anything special, she said, her voice steady but emotional. I just want a chance to leave here and build a better life. Helen seemed ready to respond, but Oliver intervened. Mom, Dad, she's right. We're wrong. I was wrong too for not seeing it before. I grew up in this environment, but I never questioned how things really worked. The silence that followed was profound. Like the walls of the house were echoing truths no one wanted to hear. Later that day, Helen called Emily to the main sitting room for a conversation. Grace and Oliver stayed at a distance, quietly listening as Helen struggled to find words she'd never said before. Emily, I'm sorry, Helen began, her voice hesitant. I know you and your family have been through a lot, and while I can't change the past, I'd like to do something to help. Emily looked at her incredulously. Help! Helen took a deep breath. By offering you the resources you need to pursue your dreams. If you want to study, we can fund your education. Grace felt a wave of relief and emotion. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Emily, however, hesitated. This won't erase what happened to my mother, she said firmly. But if you really want to change, you can start by treating the people here with the respect they deserve. Helen nodded slowly. It was clear those words had struck her deeply. That evening, during dinner, Richard surprised everyone. He addressed Grace directly. I've been thinking about what you said, he began and paused. I have to admit, there are truths we prefer to ignore when they challenge our worldview. Grace met his gaze, waiting for what would come next. My company preaches social responsibility, Richard continued. But perhaps I've neglected that here at home. That was a mistake, and I intend to correct it. Oliver offered a faint smile, relieved to see his parents acknowledging their faults. In the days that followed, changes began to take shape at the mansion. Helen became involved in volunteer initiatives, including programs to train domestic workers. Richard initiated reviews of his company's policies to ensure more inclusive and ethical practices. But the most remarkable transformation was in Emily. Thanks to Grace's support and the Walker family's initiative, she began planning her entry into business school. For the first time, the future felt full of possibilities. On Grace's last night at the mansion, she and Oliver walked through the garden under the starlight. He held her hand tightly. You've changed everything, you know. Not just for my family, but for me. Grace smiled, squeezing his hand. Maybe the change was overdue. He stopped, turning to face her. Thank you for showing me what I didn't want to see. I promise I'll make a difference moving forward. Grace knew there was still much work to be done, but she felt that the seed of change had been planted. Now it was up to Oliver and his family to make it flourish. As she looked up at the starry sky, Grace realized that this journey had been worth it, not just for Oliver or the Walkers, but because she had helped someone like Emily see that the impossible could be achieved. And to her, that was the greatest victory of all. Months had passed since Grace's turbulent revelation at the Walker mansion. While life had returned to a quieter rhythm, the effects of her presence still echoed in every corner of the house. Helen, who once exuded superiority, now showed genuine efforts to change her ways, though traces of her old self occasionally slipped through. Richard, for his part, was deeply invested in his promise to reform his company's policies and frequently attended events to discuss more inclusive practices. But the greatest transformation was in Emily. Thanks to Grace's support and the Walker family's initiative, she was finally realizing her dream of enrolling in a business administration program. Emily balanced her studies with an internship at Innovatech Solutions, Grace's company. For Emily, the world now felt much larger and full of possibilities. On a sunny day, the Walker mansion was busier than usual. Friends and family gathered in the gardens to celebrate a special event, Grace and Oliver's wedding. For many, it was more than just the union of two people. It wasn't just a wedding. It was a symbol of a larger transformation, a relationship that had broken through social barriers, and a family that had begun to see the world from a fresh perspective. Grace stood upstairs, making final adjustments to her wedding dress, while Emily, now her personal assistant, helped. "It still feels surreal to be here," Emily said with a smile, adjusting Grace's veil. Grace chuckled softly, gazing at her friend in the mirror. "Surreal for you? Imagine for me. A few months ago, I was washing dishes in this house." Emily laughed, but her expression turned serious. "You changed my life, Grace. I'll never forget that." Grace turned and took Emily's hands in hers. "You changed your own life, Emily. I just gave you a little push. Now it's your turn to show the world what you're capable of." Emily smiled, her eyes sparkling, and nodded. "I promise I'll make it count." Outside in the gardens, guests were seated in white chairs under a large canopy adorned with flowers. Helen and Richard sat in the front row, side by side. To everyone's surprise, Helen had personally helped organize the event, and her genuine smile showed her real effort to support her son and his bride. Oliver stood nervously beside the officiant, adjusting his tie. When he saw Grace walking down the aisle, his smile lit up, and all his nerves disappeared. Grace walked slowly, radiant in a simple yet elegant dress, locking eyes with Oliver. She could feel that every challenge they had faced had led them to this moment. The vows were deeply emotional. Oliver spoke about how Grace had opened his eyes to new ways of thinking, while she confessed how he had been her anchor, keeping her steady through storms of doubt. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, applause echoed through the gardens, and Oliver pulled Grace into a kiss that brought tears to many eyes. Even Helen, discreetly, dabbed at the corners of her eyes with a handkerchief. At the reception, Grace and Oliver made a point to acknowledge the people who had been instrumental in bringing them to this moment. During Grace's speech, she gave special recognition to Emily. "Emily is a shining example of how a person's potential far exceeds the circumstances they're born into," Grace said, smiling at the young woman. "I'm honored to have her by my side, both as a colleague and a friend." The guests applauded, and Emily, visibly emotional, raised her glass of champagne in gratitude. Later that night, as the event continued, Helen called Grace aside for a private conversation. They stood at the edge of the garden, where twinkling lights created a magical atmosphere. "I wanted to thank you for not giving up on us," Helen said, her honesty surprising Grace. "I know I still have a lot to learn, but I want you to know that I'm trying." Grace smiled softly. "We're all trying, Helen. The important thing is to never stop learning and changing." Helen nodded, and for the first time, Grace felt the moment was genuine, free from masks or pretense. As the night wore on, Oliver and Grace stole a moment for themselves away from the crowd. They sat on a bench in the garden under the starry sky. "It still feels surreal," Oliver said, holding Grace's hand. "Everything we went through to get here." Grace smiled. "It's been quite a journey, but I wouldn't change a thing." He leaned in and kissed her forehead, his touch filled with affection. "So what's next, Mrs. Walker Scott?" She laughed. "Well, we have a company to grow, an impact to make on the world, and maybe someday, a family to build." Oliver grinned. "That sounds perfect." The celebration stretched into the late hours, but for Grace, the real reason to celebrate went beyond the wedding itself. It was the lasting impact of her actions, the beginning of a transformation that touched not just the Walkers but also people like Emily and those who would come after her. As she watched the guests dancing under the garden lights, Grace felt a deep sense of peace and fulfillment. What had started as a search for answers had turned into a movement for change. It proved that with courage and determination, even the most entrenched barriers could be broken. And so, the future had never looked brighter. Months had passed since Grace and Oliver's wedding, but the shadow of the events that changed the lives of everyone at the Walker mansion still loomed over the family home. The transformation that Grace had sparked seemed, on the surface, to be bearing fruit. Helen had become more involved in social causes, Richard appeared more aware of his company's flaws, and Emily, with Grace's support, was stepping boldly into the business world. Yet, beneath the surface, there was still a lingering sense of unease, like a cold breeze cutting through an otherwise peaceful afternoon. As Grace looked out the window of her home, a mixture of gratitude and restlessness filled her. What had she done? She had changed so many lives, but there was more to be done. The movement she had begun deep within the Walker mansion needed to grow, expand beyond the confines of a single family, and become a societal revolution. She knew she could not rest until everything she had started truly made a difference. Oliver, sensing the tension in his wife, approached her. "You're still thinking about what comes next?" he asked softly, his hand gently resting on her shoulder. She looked at him, a sad smile forming on her face. "I just feel like I'm not finished yet. What I've done so far, it's just a start. There's more to change, more to fix. I can't stop until it's bigger than just us, bigger than the Walkers. This isn't just about one family. It's about everyone." Oliver nodded, understanding the weight of her words. He had seen her fight so hard to bring about change, to open people's eyes to the injustices that were so often overlooked. But he also knew how exhausting it had been for her. The long nights of reflection, the constant battles with her own doubts, the emotional toll of confronting people who had been blind to their privilege. "I get it, Grace," Oliver said softly. "But don't forget, you've already done something incredible. You've turned the Walkers into something unrecognizable, something better. You've shown them that change is possible, that it starts with the truth. That's not nothing." Grace's eyes flickered with a hint of uncertainty. "It's not enough. Not yet. There's a whole world out there that needs to see what we've done. If we've made a difference here, why can't we do the same elsewhere? Why can't we show others what's possible when people start being held accountable? If we just rest now, we let it all slip away." Oliver paused, his heart heavy with her words. She was right. He could feel the momentum, the shift in the air. They had already faced so much, overcome so many hurdles, but the real test, the true challenge, lay ahead. They had to ensure that their efforts reached beyond the confines of the Walker mansion. "I know," he said, pulling her closer. "I know we can do more. Let's do it together. We'll make sure this isn't just a chapter in our lives, it'll be a movement." Grace nodded, feeling a sense of purpose surge through her. It wasn't enough to change just one family. The world needed to see the truth, feel the power of accountability, and understand the importance of empathy. She couldn't do it alone, but together with Oliver, and with Emily, Helen, and Richard by her side, they could create something lasting. The next few months were a whirlwind of meetings, planning, and outreach. Grace began working with social justice organizations, pushing for corporate reforms that would focus on inclusive practices and fair treatment for all workers, regardless of their position or background. She used her platform as the CEO of Innovatech Solutions to advocate for ethical business practices, social responsibility, and diversity. Her voice, once confined to the walls of the Walker mansion, now echoed in boardrooms, at charity events, and in discussions about corporate transparency. Helen, too, found herself at the center of the movement. She had once been a symbol of the very elitism Grace had fought against, but now, she was actively working alongside Grace to raise awareness about workers' rights and support initiatives aimed at empowering marginalized communities. Helen's journey was not without its struggles. Her past actions continued to haunt her, and she often faced backlash from those who didn't believe in her sincerity. But Grace stood by her, reminding her that change wasn't just about appearances. It was about real, lasting impact. Richard, though initially resistant to some of Grace's more radical ideas, eventually came around. His company began implementing policies that promoted diversity and inclusivity, and he made efforts to ensure that the treatment of employees, especially those in lower-level positions, was fair and respectful. The public response to his changes was mixed, but Richard's determination to move forward was unwavering. He knew that the old ways of doing business were no longer sustainable, and that to truly honor his family's legacy, he had to be a part of the solution. Emily, now an intern at Innovatech Solutions, thrived in her new role. The future, which once seemed so far out of reach, was now brimming with possibilities. She excelled in her studies, balanced her coursework with her work at the company, and began to forge relationships with other young women in business. Emily's story became an inspiration to many, and she often spoke at events about her journey, from working as a maid in the Walker Mansion to pursuing her dreams at one of the most prestigious tech companies in the country. Yet, despite all the progress, Grace knew that the work was far from done. The change they had made at Innovatech, within the Walker family, and within their own hearts was just the beginning. There would always be more to do, more people to reach, more walls to break down. The fight for justice and equality wasn't a destination, it was a lifelong commitment. One evening, as Grace and Oliver sat in the garden of their new home, looking up at the stars, Grace felt a deep sense of satisfaction, tempered with the knowledge that their journey was far from over. "You know," she said softly, her voice reflecting the weight of everything she had lived through, "I never imagined we'd be here. Not like this." Oliver smiled, squeezing her hand. "I know. Neither did I. But here we are. And we've made a difference, Grace. You've made a difference." Grace looked at him, her eyes reflecting both exhaustion and hope. "The world still has so much to learn, but we've shown them it's possible to change. It's not easy and it's never quick, but every step we take makes a difference." As they sat together in the quiet night, the sound of distant laughter from their friends and family at the wedding reception still lingering in the air, Grace knew that the path they had walked was only the beginning. There was a whole world out there that needed to see, needed to understand, and needed to change. And with Oliver by her side, she was ready to keep fighting, to keep pushing, to keep leading the way for a better tomorrow. For the first time in a long time, Grace felt peace. She had done what she set out to do. The change she had sparked was real, and it was just the beginning. But, most importantly, she knew that with love, determination, and an unwavering belief in what was right, anything was possible. As the stars twinkled above, she whispered, "The future has never looked brighter." If you had fun with this story, be sure to hit that subscribe button for more awesome content. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. I'm excited to know what you think. Let's build this community together.